On the morning of June 6, 1944, General Omar Bradley stood aboard the cruiser Augusta and watched the largest amphibious invasion in human history unfold. Thousands of ships stretched across the English Channel. Hundreds of thousands of men prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy. Bradley had planned every detail. He had reviewed every contingency. He had war-gamed every scenario that could go wrong. But there was one variable he could not control. One man whose presence on the battlefield defied every calculation he had made. Somewhere in that armada, aboard a transport ship called the Bayfield, a 56-year-old brigadier general with crippling arthritis was preparing to do something no other general would attempt. He was going to wade ashore with the very first wave of infantry, armed with nothing but a pistol and a cane. Bradley had fired this man less than a year earlier. He had relieved him of command in Sicily, citing a lack of discipline and an inability to maintain proper military bearing. The army establishment had written him off as too old, too sick, and too unconventional to lead men in modern combat. Within hours, that same man would make the single most important decision of the entire Utah Beach landing. Bradley would later call it the bravest act he ever witnessed in combat. 4 simple words that would save hundreds of American lives. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the president's son, who proved that the measure of a soldier has nothing to do with age, nothing to do with physical perfection, and everything to do with the content of his character when the bullets start flying. The weight of being Theodore Roosevelt's son pressed down on young Ted from the moment he could walk. His father was a force of nature, a man who had charged up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders, hunted big game across Africa, explored uncharted rivers in Brazil, and bent the American presidency to his will through sheer determination and volcanic energy. The elder Roosevelt expected more from his firstborn son than from anyone else in the family. The pressure nearly broke the boy. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born on September 13, 1887, at Sagamore Hill, the family estate in Oyster Bay, New York. His mother was Edith Kermit Caro Roosevelt, a woman of quiet strength who provided stability in a household dominated by her husband's outsized personality. Young Ted grew up in the shadow of greatness, constantly measured against a standard few men could ever hope to meet. His father shaped him for war from childhood. During walks around the estate, the elder Roosevelt would discuss military history and draw out battle plans in the dust with the tip of his umbrella. He taught his children about Hannibal crossing the Alps, about Napoleon's campaigns across Europe, about the tactics that won and lost the great battles of history. Long before the Great War broke over Europe, the president drilled into his children that military service was not merely a duty, but a privilege that every American man should embrace. Ted attended Groton School before entering Harvard, graduating in 1909. He was not naturally called to academics, but he possessed his father's restless energy and drive for achievement. After graduation, he built a fortune in investment banking, becoming a partner at Montgomery, Clothier, and Tyler in Philadelphia. He threw himself into business with the same intensity his father brought to politics, and by the time America entered the First World War, Roosevelt had established himself as a successful and wealthy businessman. On June 20, 1910, he married Eleanor Butler Alexander. They would have 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter. The youngest son would be named Quentin, after Ted's youngest brother, a decision that would prove tragically prophetic in the years to come. When America declared war on Germany in April 1917, Ted Roosevelt was ready. He had attended the Plattsburgh military training camps, organized by General Leonard Wood in 1915, preparing alongside other businessmen and professionals for a conflict that everyone could see coming across the Atlantic. The Plattsburgh movement attracted lawyers, bankers, and executives who believed that America's business and professional elite had a special obligation to lead in wartime. Roosevelt embraced this philosophy completely. Based on his performance at Plattsburgh, he received a commission as Major in the Army Reserve and sailed for France in June 1917 with the hastily formed 1st Infantry Division. The Big Red One, as it would come to be known, was the first American division to arrive in France and would become the most storied unit in the American Expeditionary Forces. Assigned to the 26th Infantry Regiment, Roosevelt earned recognition as the best battalion commander in his division, according to the division commander himself. His concern for his men became legendary among the soldiers who served under him. When the army failed to provide adequate footwear for the muddy trenches of France, Roosevelt purchased combat boots for his entire battalion with his own money. He shared their hardships without complaint, ate their food, slept in their trenches, and never asked them to endure anything he would not endure himself. At the Battle of Cantigny, from May 28 to May 31, 1918, America's first major offensive victory of the war, Roosevelt proved his courage under fire. He bravely led his battalion across open fields outside the town to fill a gap in the American lines when German counterattacks threatened to overwhelm the initial gains. His Distinguished Service Cross citation records that after the completion of a raid, Major Roosevelt exposed himself to intense machine gun, rifle, and grenade fire while he went forward and assisted in rescuing a wounded member of the raiding party. He could have remained in relative safety behind the lines. Instead, he went forward into the fire. Then came Soissons. On July 19, 1918, during the great Allied counter-offensive that would ultimately break the German army, Roosevelt personally led the assault companies of his battalion into the teeth of German defenses. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat against an enemy that knew they were losing but refused to give ground easily. A machine gun bullet tore through Roosevelt's left knee as he advanced at the head of his men. He refused evacuation and continued directing the attack until loss of blood forced his soldiers to carry him off the field against his protests. The Germans also gassed him during the assault, and he nearly lost his vision. These wounds would define the rest of his life. The knee never healed properly. Severe arthritis spread through his joints over the following decades, eventually requiring him to walk with a cane. The pain became a constant companion that he learned to ignore through sheer willpower. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the resolve it forged within him. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. had proven to himself that he could face death without flinching. That knowledge would sustain him through everything that followed. Roosevelt finished the First World War as a lieutenant colonel commanding the entire 26th Infantry Regiment. He was one of the most decorated American officers of the conflict, having earned the Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Silver Stars, the Purple Heart, the French Legion of Honor, and the Croix de Guerre. In February 1919, he helped organize the preliminary meetings that led to the founding of the American Legion at the Paris Caucus the following month. The organization would become one of the most influential veterans groups in American history. Roosevelt declined the nomination as its first national commander, believing that accepting would make him appear politically motivated rather than genuinely devoted to the welfare of his fellow veterans. Between the wars, Roosevelt pursued both public service and private success with characteristic energy. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1921 to 1924, the same position his father had held before the Spanish-American War. He ran for governor of New York in 1924, losing to Al Smith in a campaign marked by dirty tricks and personal attacks. He served as governor of Puerto Rico from 1929 to 1932, where he learned Spanish fluently and earned the affectionate nickname El Jibaro de la Fortaleza, the common man of the fortress, for his efforts to improve the lives of ordinary Puerto Ricans. From 1932 to 1933, he served as Governor-General of the Philippines, gaining experience in colonial administration that would prove valuable in his military career. Throughout these years, Roosevelt remained active in the Army Reserve. He completed the Command and General Staff College, studying the latest developments in military tactics and strategy. He followed events in Europe closely, watching Hitler's rise to power with growing alarm. He knew another war was coming. He intended to be ready when it arrived. But there was something Roosevelt kept hidden from everyone, including his beloved wife Eleanor. His heart was failing. He had developed serious cardiac problems, irregular heartbeats that frequently left him breathless and weak. The condition grew worse as the years passed. Army doctors would never have cleared him for combat duty if they had known the truth, so Roosevelt told no one. He concealed his condition at all costs, determined that nothing would keep him from leading men in battle one more time. When America entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt immediately sought a combat command. He was 54 years old. He walked with a cane. He suffered from arthritis so severe that he could barely lift his arms above his shoulders on bad days. The army brass looked at him and saw a relic from another era, a man whose best days were clearly behind him, a liability rather than an asset on the modern battlefield. Roosevelt saw something different in the mirror. He saw a soldier who still had one more fight left in him. He saw a man who owed it to his country and to his father's memory to serve when his nation needed him most. He was assigned as Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Infantry Division, the same big red one he had fought with in France a quarter-century earlier. Working alongside Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, Roosevelt helped lead the division through the invasion of North Africa and into Sicily. The partnership seemed ideal. Both men were unconventional leaders who cared more about results than regulations, more about winning battles than impressing superior officers. The 1st Division under Allen and Roosevelt became perhaps the most effective fighting force in the Mediterranean theatre. They fought through Tunisia with a ferocity that earned them respect from friend and foe alike. They stormed the beaches of Sicily and drove inland against determined German resistance. The soldiers of the Big Red One developed an esprit de corps that set them apart from every other American unit, but their very success planted the seeds of their downfall. The men of the 1st Division developed a swagger that bordered on arrogance. They looked down on rear echelon troops and support units. They brawled in the streets of North African towns when given leave. They ignored regulations they considered pointless and showed little respect for officers outside their own division. They fought hard, but they also played hard, and incidents of misconduct multiplied as the campaign progressed. Senior commanders began to complain that the division had become uncontrollable. Staff officers whispered that Allen and Roosevelt had lost their grip on discipline. The 1st Division was winning battles, but it was embarrassing the army in the process. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 2nd Corps, watched with growing concern. Bradley was everything Roosevelt was not. He was methodical where Roosevelt was instinctive. He was reserved where Roosevelt was flamboyant. He was a firm believer in discipline, regulations, and proper military bearing. What he saw in the 1st Division offended his deepest professional sensibilities. On July 31, 1943, Bradley secured permission from General Eisenhower to relieve both Allen and Roosevelt from command. The decision was transmitted by telegram on August 7, 1943, during the brutal Battle of Troina, which one observer called the toughest battle Americans had fought since the First World War. The timing seemed almost cruel, removing the division's leaders in the middle of their hardest fight. Bradley's assessment of Roosevelt was devastating. In his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, he wrote that Roosevelt had sinned by loving the division too much. Under Allen, Bradley continued, the 1st Division had become increasingly temperamental and disdainful of both regulations and senior commands. It thought itself exempted from the need for discipline by virtue of its months on the line. Despite their prodigal talents as combat leaders, Bradley concluded, neither Terry Allen nor Roosevelt possessed the instincts of a good disciplinarian. They looked upon discipline as an unwelcome crutch to be used by less able and personable commanders. Roosevelt was devastated by the relief. Bidding farewell to the 26th Infantry that he had commanded in the First World War, he wept openly in front of men he had led through some of the toughest fighting of 2 wars. His response to Bradley was characteristically blunt and tinged with bitterness. "Brad," he said, "we get along a hell of a lot better with the Krauts up front than we do with your people back here in the rear." Assigned to a staff position as liaison officer between the Fifth Army and French Expeditionary Corps in Italy, Roosevelt ached to return to combat command. The staff work bored him. The politics disgusted him. He wrote to Bradley begging for another chance to lead men in battle. "If you ask me," he wrote, "I will swim in with a howitzer strapped to my back. Anything at all. Just help me get out of this rat's nest down here." Most men would have accepted their fate after being relieved in disgrace. They had been judged and found wanting by the military establishment. They were too old, too unconventional, too undisciplined for modern warfare. The proper thing to do was accept a comfortable staff position, wait out the war, and retire with whatever dignity remained. Roosevelt refused to give up. In February 1944, he got his chance. Bradley himself, the same general who had fired him, requested that Roosevelt be assigned to England as Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry Division under Major General Raymond O. Barton. The division had arrived in England only the previous month. They were green to fire, completely untested in combat, exactly the kind of unit that needed steadying by a veteran presence when they hit the invasion beaches. Bradley later explained his thinking. If Roosevelt could go in with the leading wave, he could steady it as no other man could. Ted was immune to fear. That combination of experience and fearlessness was exactly what the green troops of the 4th Division would need when they waded ashore into German machine gun fire. Barton was a West Pointer and an excellent trainer of troops. He developed deep respect for the Harvard man with the cane and the crooked grin who joined his staff. Roosevelt threw himself into preparing the division for the invasion, visiting units, learning names, building the relationships that would matter when the shooting started. But when Roosevelt made 2 verbal requests to land with the first wave on the invasion beaches, Barton denied them both. His concerns were completely legitimate. Roosevelt was 56 years old. He walked with a cane because of his wounded knee. He appeared frail and exhausted much of the time. The first wave of any amphibious assault was the most dangerous place on the battlefield. Men would die by the hundreds before they even reached dry sand. The German defences were formidable. The obstacles were deadly. Putting a general officer in that chaos seemed like an invitation to disaster. Roosevelt refused to accept no for an answer. On May 26, 1944, he put his request in writing. The letter, now preserved at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, contained 7 carefully reasoned arguments for why he should be allowed to land with the assault companies. The force and skill with which the first elements hit the beach and proceed may determine the ultimate success of the operation, Roosevelt wrote. With troops engaged for the first time, the behavior pattern of all is apt to be set by those first engagements. I believe I can contribute materially on all of the above by going in with the assault companies, he continued. Furthermore, I personally know both officers and men of these advance units and believe that it will steady them to know that I am with them. Then came the argument that captured everything about who Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was, everything about his understanding of leadership, everything about why men would follow him into fire. They will figure that if a general is going in, it cannot be that rough. He closed the letter with 5 simple words that revealed his heart. I would love to do this. Barton read the letter and felt his own heart sink. He knew what approving this request would mean. Years later, he recalled his decision with painful clarity. I loved Ted, Barton said. When I finally agreed to his landing with the first wave, I felt sure he would be killed. When I had bade him goodbye, I never expected to see him alive. The night before the invasion, aboard the transport Bayfield, Roosevelt moved among his men, offering encouragement and steadying their nerves. He led them in singing Onward Christian Soldiers and the Battle Hymn of the Republic. He entertained officers by reciting Kipling poetry from memory, verse after verse, flowing effortlessly from a mind that held literature as easily as it held battle plans. Then he sat down and wrote what he believed might be his final letter to Eleanor. We are starting on the great venture of the war, he told her. We have had a grand life, and I hope there will be more. We have been very happy. I pray we may be together again. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Roosevelt boarded a landing craft alongside Captain Leonard Schroeder of Company F, 2nd Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment. Roosevelt had visited Schroeder in a hospital before the invasion, telling him to recover quickly because he intended to ride on his boat when they went ashore. He had kept his promise. The channel crossing was rough. Seasick soldiers huddled miserably in the bottom of the landing craft as waves crashed over the sides and spray soaked everyone aboard. The boats pitched and rolled in the heavy swells. Men vomited over the gunwales. Others bailed water with their helmets to keep the craft from swamping. The tension was almost unbearable as they motored through the darkness toward the most heavily defended coastline in Europe. Roosevelt stood near the bow, scanning the dark horizon for the first glimpse of France. His cane was tucked under his arm. His pistol was holstered at his side. Whatever fear he felt, he kept it hidden. He had been through this before, in another war, in another century. He knew what awaited them on that beach. He also knew that the men around him were looking to see how their general was handling the tension, so he stood calmly, projecting confidence he may not have entirely felt, showing them by example how a soldier faces battle. The naval bombardment began before dawn, hundreds of warships hurling thousands of tons of steel at the German fortifications. The noise was tremendous, a continuous rolling thunder that made conversation impossible. Flashes lit the horizon like distant lightning. Somewhere beyond that wall of fire and smoke lay their objective, Utah Beach. The first wave touched down at approximately 6:30 in the morning. Captain Schroeder was first down the ramp into the waist-deep water. Roosevelt followed immediately after, splashing into the cold channel surf with his cane in one hand. Something was wrong. Strong tidal currents had swept all 20 landing craft approximately 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. 3 of the 4 guide boats had struck mines and sunk, leaving only one to orient the confused flotilla. Thick smoke from the naval bombardment obscured the landmarks they had memorized from aerial photographs and training models. Nothing looked the way it was supposed to look. Roosevelt recognized the navigation error almost immediately. He later wrote that the moment he arrived at the beach, he knew something was wrong because there was a house by the seawall where none should have been, according to the reconnaissance photographs. Captain Howard Lees of Company E crouched atop a sand dune and told Roosevelt that this did not look like what they had shown them on the tabletop models back in England. Roosevelt told him to sit tight, then walked back toward the beach through the confusion to reorient himself and figure out exactly where they had landed. The navigation error had put them at Exit 2, a causeway called La Grande Dune, instead of Exit 3 at Les Dunes de Varaville where they were supposed to land. This mattered enormously. The Germans had flooded the lowlands behind Utah Beach, creating vast marshes that were impassable to vehicles and deadly to infantry trying to wade through them. Only 4 raised causeways provided routes for moving troops and equipment inland from the beach. Each exit was a potential choke point. Each exit could become a killing ground if the Germans concentrated their defenses there. Roosevelt held a hasty council of war in a shallow foxhole with the key officers who had made it ashore. Captain James Arnold, the Navy control officer responsible for directing the landing craft, was there. So was Colonel James Van Fleet, commanding the 8th Infantry Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Conrad Simmons of the 1st Battalion and Lieutenant Colonel Carlton McNeely of the 2nd Battalion joined them in the cramped space as German shells exploded nearby. 2 options existed. They could move the troops 2,000 yards north along the beach to the original landing site, following the plan exactly as it had been designed and rehearsed. Or they could improvise, funneling the entire division through Exit 2 where they had actually landed and adjusting all subsequent operations accordingly. Moving north meant exposing thousands of men to German fire as they trudged along the exposed waterline. It meant traffic jams and confusion as successive waves landed at the planned site, while the first wave tried to work its way back north. It meant delay, disorder, and death on a beach swept by artillery and machine gun fire. But staying put meant abandoning the carefully rehearsed plan that everyone had memorized. It meant redirecting an entire division on the fly, changing every detail that had been drilled into the men for months of training. It meant trusting that the causeway in front of them was actually passable, that the German defenses were actually weaker here than at the planned landing site. Roosevelt made his decision in seconds. In his characteristic gravelly voice, he announced what Bradley would later call the single most heroic act he ever witnessed in combat. "I am going ahead with the troops," Roosevelt declared. "Get word to the Navy to bring them in. We will start the war from right here." The accidental location proved tactically superior to the planned landing site. Only one German strongpoint defended the area immediately in front of Exit 2, and it had been badly damaged by the pre-invasion aerial bombardment. The planned site at Exit 3 had 2 strongpoints with overlapping fields of fire that would have created a deadly crossfire. Roosevelt's improvised decision would save hundreds of American lives over the course of the day. For the next several hours, Roosevelt became the living symbol of calm under fire. One sergeant from the 8th Infantry observed him walking along the beach with a cane in one hand and a map in the other, looking like he was examining some real estate he was thinking about buying. He wore a knit cap because he hated the heavy army helmets that aggravated his arthritis. He carried his silver-plated .45 caliber pistol, but never drew it throughout the entire day. When artillery shells exploded nearby, sand showered down on Roosevelt. He brushed the dirt from his shoulders impatiently and kept walking as if the German fire was merely an annoyance rather than a mortal threat. When a shell killed several soldiers wading ashore, leaving one survivor staggering onto the beach with a blackened face and staring eyes, Roosevelt ran to him despite his bad knee. He put his arm around the shell-shocked man's shoulders and spoke gently. "Son," he said, "I think we will get you back on a boat." When soldiers tried to help him into a landing craft, thinking the old man needed assistance, he growled good-naturedly. "Get the hell out of my way," he said. "I can jump in there by myself. I can take it as well as any of you." When Lieutenant Colonel Chuck Jackson told him they were at the front and pointed to scouts just 50 meters ahead of their position, Roosevelt replied simply, "Let us go talk to them." And he walked forward into the fire. A sergeant from the 237th Engineer Combat Battalion watched in disbelief as Roosevelt walked near explosive charges that were about to be detonated to clear beach obstacles. "Go knock that man down," he shouted to the soldiers around him. "He is going to get killed." Someone asked if he knew who that was. The sergeant replied that he knew perfectly well it was General Roosevelt, and he was going to get killed anyway if he did not get clear of the explosives. The general walked on, completely unconcerned. Roosevelt personally scouted the terrain inland from the beach to locate the causeways that would allow vehicles to move off the sand. He met arriving units at the waterline and pointed them toward their new objectives. He directed every successive wave throughout the morning, standing exposed on the beach while German shells fell around him, a visible symbol of calm leadership that steadied men who might otherwise have panicked. To Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Teague of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Regiment, who arrived with a later wave confused about where to go, Roosevelt explained the situation clearly. "We had landed to the left of where we were supposed to have landed," Roosevelt said, "and he wanted this part of the beach cleared as soon as possible. He wanted action from the men immediately after landing. No excuses, no delays, get moving inland." By 11 in the morning, just 4.5 hours after the first wave landed, troops had linked up with the 101st Airborne Division at Pouperville, several miles inland. The paratroopers had jumped in the early hours before dawn, scattering across the Norman countryside in the darkness. Many had landed far from their drop zones. Some had drowned in the flooded fields. Others had been killed before they could free themselves from their parachute harnesses. But those who survived had been fighting all night to secure the causeways from the inland side. When the soldiers from Utah Beach reached Pouperville, they found exhausted paratroopers who had been fighting for hours with no certainty that the invasion had even succeeded. The link-up was a moment of profound relief for both groups. The beach forces now had a secure route inland. The airborne forces now knew that reinforcements were coming. The invasion was working. By noon, all 4 causeway exits from Utah Beach were secured. By late afternoon, over 20,000 men and 1,700 vehicles had landed successfully and were moving inland to expand the beachhead. Utah Beach suffered the lowest casualty rate of all 5 invasion beaches that day. 197 American soldiers were killed in the beach landing operations at Utah. At Omaha Beach, just a few miles to the east where the landings nearly failed, approximately 2,400 men fell killed or wounded. The carnage at Omaha was so severe that commanders briefly considered abandoning the beach entirely. The difference between triumph at Utah and near disaster at Omaha came down to multiple factors. German defenses at Utah were weaker, manned by lower quality troops. The naval and aerial bombardment had been more effective. The timing of the assault wave relative to the tide was better. But none of that would have mattered if chaos had paralyzed the landing force in those critical first hours. At Omaha, confusion reigned for hours as units landed in the wrong places and officers were killed before they could organize their men. The survivors huddled behind obstacles and seawalls, pinned down and taking casualties, until small groups of leaders finally rallied them to break through the German defenses. The losses were staggering. At Utah, that chaos never materialized because Roosevelt was there to impose order from the first moments. His decision to start the war from right here, made within minutes of landing, meant that every subsequent wave knew exactly where to go and what to do. There was no deadly confusion, no hours lost while officers tried to figure out what had gone wrong. One clear decision by one calm leader prevented the kind of paralysis that cost so many lives at Omaha. After the beaches were secured, Roosevelt continued pushing forward with the 4th Division as they drove inland through the Norman hedgerow country. The bocage, as the French called it, was a nightmare for advancing troops. Ancient hedgerows lined every field, dense walls of earth and vegetation that had grown for centuries. Each field became a potential ambush site. German defenders used the terrain brilliantly, making the Americans pay for every yard of ground. Roosevelt ignored the danger and kept moving forward with his men. They marched to Sainte-Mère-Église and then north toward the vital port of Cherbourg. At the end of June, Roosevelt served briefly as military governor of Cherbourg after the port's capture, setting up his headquarters in a cellar lit by a single oil lamp, while his staff worked to restore order to the devastated city. His health was failing visibly now. The constant rain of the Normandy summer kept his clothes perpetually wet, aggravating his arthritis until every movement was painful. The heart condition he had hidden from everyone for so long was finally catching up with him. He grew weaker with each passing day, but he refused to slow down. He named his Jeep Rough Rider after his father's famous regiment from the Spanish-American War and continued visiting the front lines daily, showing the soldiers that their general was still with them. On July 12, 1944, General Bradley selected Roosevelt for promotion to Major General and command of the 90th Infantry Division, which had suffered serious leadership problems since the invasion. It was a vindication of everything Roosevelt had fought for, proof that the man Bradley had once fired was now trusted to rescue a troubled division. Bradley sent the recommendation to General Eisenhower, who approved it immediately. When Eisenhower called Bradley the next morning to confirm the promotion and discuss the details of Roosevelt's new command, he received devastating news instead. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. had died during the night. On his final evening, Roosevelt spent nearly 3 hours with his son, Captain Quentin Roosevelt II, who had landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day with a separate unit. This made them the only father and son known to have landed on the invasion beaches together on June 6th. They talked about the campaign, about the family, about everything fathers and sons talk about when they have the chance. Around 10 in the evening, after his son departed, Roosevelt suffered a massive heart attack alone in his quarters. He died at approximately midnight on July 12, 1944, in a converted German military truck that served as his sleeping quarters at Meauties in Normandy. He was 56 years old. The cause was coronary thrombosis, the heart condition he had hidden for years, the secret he had kept so that the army would let him fight, had finally claimed him. Bradley wrote that Ted had died as no one could have believed he would, in the quiet of his tent, not on the battlefield where everyone expected he would fall. General Patton recorded in his diary that Teddy Roosevelt had died in his sleep the previous night. He had made 3 combat landings with the leading wave in this war alone, Patton noted. Such is fate. Barton rushed to Roosevelt's side as soon as he received word. He was breathing but unconscious when I entered his truck, Barton later wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. I sat helpless and saw the most gallant soldier and finest gentleman I have ever known expire. Roosevelt was buried on July 14, 1944, Bastille Day, exactly 26 years to the day after his youngest brother Quentin was shot down over France in the First World War. The army band played "The Son of God Goes Forth to War" as artillery rumbled in the distance, a reminder that the fighting continued even as they honoured their fallen general. He was the only soldier buried in a coffin at Temporary Cemetery No. 2 at Sainte-Mère-Église. Everyone else was buried in mattress covers. 6 generals served as honorary pallbearers at the funeral. Omar Bradley was there, so was George Patton. Raymond Barton attended, along with Clarence Hubner, Courtney Hodges, and J. Lawton Collins. It was a remarkable gathering of the most senior American commanders in Europe, men who had set aside their differences and their schedules to honor a fellow soldier. And it was especially remarkable because both Bradley and Patton had once been instrumental in relieving Roosevelt from command. The men who had questioned his fitness for modern warfare now stood in silence over his grave, paying tribute to a soldier whose courage had exceeded their expectations and their judgment. Barton had originally recommended Roosevelt for the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on D-Day. Higher headquarters decided that recommendation was insufficient for what Roosevelt had accomplished. They upgraded the award to the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. On September 21, 1944, Secretary of War Henry Stimson presented the Medal of Honor to Roosevelt's widow Eleanor at a ceremony in the Pentagon. The official citation captures what Roosevelt accomplished on that June morning when everything went wrong and one man's decision set everything right. For gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, it reads. After 2 verbal requests to accompany the leading assault elements in the Normandy invasion had been denied, Brigadier General Roosevelt's written request for this mission was approved, and he landed with the first wave of the forces assaulting the enemy-held beaches. He repeatedly led groups from the beach, over the seawall, and established them inland. The citation continues. His valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack, and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire, inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brigadier General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strongpoints and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualties. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. Roosevelt was one of only 4 men to receive the Medal of Honor for actions, specifically on June 6, 1944. The others were Private Carlton Barrett, First Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith Jr., and Technician 5th Grade John Pinder Jr. All 3 of them served at Omaha Beach, where the fighting was far more desperate than at Utah. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and his father remain one of only 2 father and son pairs in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. The other pair is Arthur MacArthur Jr. and his more famous son, Douglas MacArthur. The elder Roosevelt's medal came more than a century after his action at the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898. The original nomination was blocked by the Secretary of War in retaliation for Roosevelt's public criticism of the War Department's handling of the Cuban campaign. Congress eventually repealed the statute of limitations on military decorations, and President Bill Clinton awarded the medal on January 16, 2001. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. remains the only American president to receive the Medal of Honor and the only person in history to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Nobel Peace Prize. The youngest Roosevelt brother, Quentin, was killed on July 14, 1918, Bastille Day, at the age of 20. Flying a Nieuport 28 fighter aircraft with the 95th Aero Squadron, he was shot down over Chamery in France, struck by 2 machine gun bullets to the head during aerial combat. Multiple German pilots were credited with the kill, though no single victor was ever definitively established. The Germans buried young Quentin Roosevelt with full military honors and flew over his airfield to drop notes confirming his death and honorable burial. Even in war, there remained room for chivalry. On September 22, 1955, Quentin's remains were exhumed from his original grave at Chamery and reinterred at the Normandy American Cemetery, to rest beside his brother Theodore Jr. They lie together now in Plot D, Row 28, Graves 45 and 46. Quentin is the only First World War soldier buried in the Normandy Cemetery. There are 45 sets of brothers buried at Normandy. 33 of them lie side by side. Roosevelt's son, Quentin II, wrote to his mother after his father's death. "The lion is dead," he said, using the family's affectionate nickname for Theodore Jr. To me, he was much more than simply a father. He was an amazing combination of father, brother, friend, and comrade in battle. The transformation in how his former critics viewed him tells us everything we need to know about Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s ultimate legacy. Patton, who had once dismissed him, wrote after his death that Roosevelt was one of the bravest men he ever knew. Bradley, who had relieved him for loving his division too much, declared that when asked to name the single most heroic action he had ever seen in combat, his answer was 4 words: Ted Roosevelt, Utah Beach. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who knew nearly every important figure in the European theatre, captured Roosevelt's unique essence in a dispatch from the front. "There is something almost Mongolian about his face," Pyle wrote. "When cleaned up, he could be a Cossack. When tired and dirty, he could be a movie gangster. But either way, his eyes always twinkle." His aide, Lieutenant Marcus Stevenson, observed that Roosevelt was the most disreputable-looking general he had ever met. "He looked like the most beat-up soldier you ever saw," Stevenson said. "Not like a general at all." Perhaps Roosevelt himself said it best, in a letter to his wife after D-Day, explaining why he had insisted on landing with the first wave. "It steadies the young men to know that I am with them," he wrote, plodding along with my cane. Henry Fonda portrayed Roosevelt in the 1962 film The Longest Day, based on Cornelius Ryan's meticulously researched book about D-Day. The portrayal helped ensure that Roosevelt's story reached millions of viewers who might otherwise never have known about the old man with the cane who changed the course of history on Utah Beach. Roosevelt understood something fundamental about leadership that his critics never grasped. Leadership is not about physical perfection, or following regulations, or maintaining proper military bearing. It is about being there when your men need you most, about showing them through your presence that the task in front of them is not impossible. "They will figure that if a general is going in," he wrote in that letter to Barton, "it cannot be that rough." Those 12 words explain why a man who could barely walk insisted on being first off the landing craft, why a man with a failing heart stood exposed while shells fell around him, why a man the establishment had written off made the decision that saved hundreds of lives. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering Theodore Roosevelt Jr. The lessons of his life extend far beyond military history. We still judge people by appearance rather than ability. We still write off those who fail to meet narrow expectations. Roosevelt proved on that beach that what matters is not what others see when they look at you. What matters is what you do when the moment demands everything you have. He gave everything. And because he did, thousands of young men went home to their families. That is his legacy. That is why his story still matters.